10 years pretending I couldn't read, 10 years living a lie to discover an even more painful truth. When I opened that red leather diary for the first time, I never imagined I was opening the door to my own liberation. Hello, everyone. My name is Dorothy Mendenhall Wilson. I'm 82 years old, and today I'm going to share with you a story I've kept in my heart for over 5 decades. A story of pain, but also of courage and resilience. Before I begin, if you're watching this video now, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to turn on notifications to receive more stories like this one. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. I was born in 1943 in a small town in rural Georgia, where a girl's destiny was mapped out before she even learned to walk. I grew up hearing my father say that women only needed to know how to cook, sew, and raise children. Books were rare in our house, kept like forbidden treasures on a shelf too high for my small hands to reach. Our farm was 4 miles from the nearest school, and only my brothers were allowed to attend. "Girls who study too much scare away husbands," my mother would say, repeating what her mother had told her. It was like a mantra passed from generation to generation, chaining dreams before they could even bloom. But destiny has its own plans, doesn't it? When I turned 11, the daughter of the neighboring plantation owner, a girl named Lucy, began receiving private lessons from a teacher from town. Miss Dorothy was a lady with round glasses and gray hair, always pinned in a perfect bun. She came 3 times a week in a navy blue car that I could see from my bedroom window. One day, while helping my mother collect eggs in the hen house near the fence that divided our properties, I saw Miss Dorothy sitting under a tree, teaching Lucy to read from a storybook. I was mesmerized. The words seemed to dance on the girl's lips as she followed the lines on the page with her finger. "What are you staring at, child?" my mother asked. "Nothing, Mama," I replied, lowering my eyes to the egg basket, but the seed had already been planted. That same afternoon, I waited until my mother was busy with lunch preparations and ran to the fence. Miss Dorothy was still there, putting her books away in a leather satchel. "Ma'am, do you teach just anyone to read?" I asked, my heart pounding. She looked at me over her glasses, a kind smile forming on her lips. "Anyone who wants to learn, my dear." "And if I bring eggs and vegetables from our garden, would you teach me too?" That's how my secret began. 3 times a week, while Lucy was learning mathematics inside the house, I would meet Miss Dorothy for half an hour behind the barn. I'd bring a bundle with fresh eggs, tomatoes, lettuce, or whatever I could take without raising suspicion. In exchange, she taught me letters, then syllables, words, and finally, entire sentences. I learned to read in secret under the shade of trees, in constant fear of being discovered. At night, I practiced drawing letters in the dirt of the yard, quickly erasing them with my foot. When I got a piece of old newspaper, I'd hide it under my mattress and read by the light of short candle stubs I'd smuggled from the kitchen. "You have a mind as sharp as a new knife, Dorothy," Miss Dorothy would say. "It's a shame that so many girls like you don't get the chance to study." I spent 8 years like this, learning in secret, devouring any text that fell into my hands. By 19, I read with the fluency of someone who had attended school their whole life, but almost nobody knew. It was my hidden treasure, my small, silent rebellion. It was around this time that I met Gerald Augustine Wilson. He arrived in our town in 1962. A 34-year-old widower, elegant, owner of the largest fabric store in the region. Tall, with black hair already showing silver at the temples, he had penetrating brown eyes and a smile that charmed all the young women. I remember it like it was yesterday. It was market day in the town square, and I had gone with my mother to sell our vegetables. Gerald stopped at our stall, looked at the tomatoes, and smiled at me. "Young lady, you have the reddest tomatoes at the market," he said, his eyes fixed on mine, "and the most carefully tended ones, too." I blushed to the roots of my hair. In the following Saturdays, he always appeared at our stall. He bought little but talked a lot. My mother, noticing his interest, began sending me alone to the market. "An established man, a widower, no children. It's a blessing, my daughter." After 3 months of courtship, Gerald asked for my hand in marriage. My father, enchanted by the prospect of having a merchant as a son-in-law, accepted immediately. I was fascinated by this sophisticated man who talked about distant places that I only knew from descriptions in the few books I had read. It was during our engagement that I noticed something curious. One day in the fabric store, Gerald showed me a catalog with new patterns arriving from New York. I instinctively began reading the names of the fabrics. He seemed surprised. "You can read, Dorothy?" Something made me hesitate. The tone of his voice carried an almost imperceptible note of disappointment. I quickly lied. "Just some simple words my brother taught me. This one is silk, isn't it? And this one? This I don't know." The smile returned to his lips, wider now. "It's Egyptian cotton, my dear. Don't worry. You don't need to know these things. A simple woman is a blessing. Let me take care of the business and the paperwork." That phrase lit a warning signal inside me. Why did he seem relieved by my supposed ignorance? But love and inexperience made me ignore that sign. I decided to keep my reading ability a secret, at least for now. We married in June 1963. The ceremony was the most luxurious our town had ever seen. I moved into his house, an imposing two-story building near the town square. The first months were an adjustment. Gerald was an organized man, almost obsessive about certain habits. His clothes needed to be ironed in a specific way, his meals served at exactly the same times. And then I noticed the Thursday ritual. Every Thursday after dinner, Gerald would lock himself in his study for at least an hour. "I need to update the store's accounting books," he would say. I could hear the scratch of the pen on paper, the occasional turning of pages. One night, about 6 months after our wedding, I took him tea during this ritual. I knocked on the door and waited. When I entered, I saw Gerald quickly closing a red leather book. It wasn't one of the store's accounting books that I had seen before. Those were bound in black leather with the store's name embossed in gold. "What's that red book, darling?" I asked innocently. He smiled, putting it away in a drawer that he locked with a small key. "Just a personal diary, my dear. We all have our little secrets, don't we?" "Do you write about me in that diary?" I asked, trying to sound playful. "About us, about life, about business. A man needs to organize his thoughts." That night, while Gerald slept, I lay awake thinking about that red book. What would he write in there that needed to be kept under lock and key? Why every Thursday with the regularity of a clock? And why did his mood often change after these writing sessions? Sometimes agitated, sometimes strangely too calm. Weeks later, during breakfast, Gerald slid a paper toward me. "I need you to learn to sign your name on documents, my dear. I can't keep signing everything for you." It was a perfect opportunity to maintain my facade. I picked up the pen awkwardly, as I had seen illiterate women do at the market. I pretended difficulty, frowning, moving my lips silently. I drew my name with large, irregular letters, like a child learning to write. "Is this good?" I asked, looking at him with innocent eyes. Gerald smiled, satisfied. "Perfect, my dear. You'll improve with time. And these other words here, what are they?" He pointed to the document. "This says property owner, and here is witness, but don't worry about that. I just need your signature." It was at that moment that I made a decision that would change my life. I would keep my knowledge a secret. Something told me there was an advantage in being underestimated by my husband. I didn't know what yet, but my instinct screamed for me to continue the charade. As the months passed, I perfected my act. When I needed to read something, I would squint, move my fingers slowly under the words, murmuring as if I were struggling to decipher the text. I began to learn slowly, recognizing basic words with exaggerated enthusiasm. "Look, Gerald, this word is bread, isn't it? And this one is milk." He always reacted with a condescending smile, sometimes patting me on the head as if I were a precocious child. "Very good, my little one. Soon you'll be able to read your entire shopping list." Once, he left a business letter on the living room table. When I saw him watching, I picked up the paper and pretended to try to read it. After a few moments, I sighed in frustration. I can't understand anything when the letters are all joined together like this. Ah, that's cursive writing, my dear. It is more difficult. It looks like a bunch of worms dancing on the paper, I exclaimed, returning the letter with a defeated expression. Gerald laughed, putting the document in his pocket. That's why I write like that in my diary. It's also the only way I learned in school. And so my secrets stay protected from curious eyes. Little did he know that with this confession, he had given me the perfect key to maintain my charade. From then on, whenever I saw something in cursive writing, I demonstrated complete inability to understand it. It was the perfect excuse to never arouse suspicions about the red leather diary. Time passed, and I continued to be the perfect wife, beautiful, obedient, and nearly illiterate. Gerald seemed increasingly comfortable with my apparent limitation. At social gatherings, he would explain to others with paternal pride how he was slowly educating his wife. Men admired him for his patience. Women looked at me with pity, and every Thursday, punctually after dinner, he would lock himself in that study with his red diary, writing secrets he believed were forever protected by my ignorance and his impenetrable cursive handwriting. What he didn't know was that I was just waiting for the right moment to discover what those pages were hiding. And that moment would arrive sooner than either of us could imagine. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for your company. As I said, my name is Dorothy, and I'm sharing a story that I kept secret for many decades. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please do so now and turn on notifications. Every like and share encourages me to continue telling these life stories that might help others. Let's continue where we left off. It was a particularly hot summer in July of 1968. We had completed almost 5 years of marriage, and I continued to play my role as a semi-illiterate wife to perfection. Gerald never suspected that in the afternoons, while he worked at the store, I devoured books I borrowed from my only friend in town, Ophelia Fitzgerald. Ophelia worked at the only bank in our town, a single woman in her early 30s who faced malicious comments about being an old maid with an enigmatic smile and a rare independence for women of that time. We met at church, and somehow she sensed my secret. "You're not as simple as you want to appear, are you, Dorothy?" she said to me one day while we were alone, arranging flowers for Sunday Mass. I froze, afraid that my charade had been discovered and would reach Gerald's ears. "I don't know what you're talking about," I replied, avoiding her eyes. "I saw you at last Sunday's service. While everyone was looking at the hymnal, you were looking straight ahead, but singing every word perfectly, without glancing at the book even once." I felt my face burn. I had been careless. "Please don't tell anyone," I whispered. Ophelia smiled. "Your secret is safe with me. But why pretend? Wouldn't your husband be proud to have an educated wife?" I explained that Gerald seemed to prefer my supposed ignorance, as if it made him feel more secure, more in control. "Weak men fear strong women," she replied simply, "and men with secrets fear intelligent women." That phrase kept hammering in my head for days. What secrets could Gerald have? Our life seemed so ordinary, so within the standards of that time. Him at the store, me at home, dinners with other merchants on Saturdays, church on Sundays. It was Ophelia who started lending me books. Novels, yes, but also books on basic accounting, women's rights, and even a legal guide on property and inheritance. I hid them inside a false sewing box, beneath threads and buttons, and read only during the afternoons, always with the window open to hear if anyone was approaching. "Knowledge is a powerful weapon," Ophelia would say, "especially for us women who have so few." In that July of 1968, something extraordinary happened. It was a Thursday, the day of Gerald's writing ritual. But that specific night, we received news that his brother, Theodore, would visit us over the weekend. Gerald became visibly nervous. "I need to prepare the rooms, clean the whole house," he said, pacing back and forth. "But Martha already cleans everything every week," I replied, referring to our maid who came 3 times a week. "My brother has eagle eyes, Dorothy. He sees dirt where none exists," Gerald retorted, irritated. "And that woman doesn't know how to clean properly. Tomorrow you'll have to supervise every corner." I realized it was the first time he had mentioned a flaw in me. Usually it was just praise about how impeccably I kept the house, what a good cook I was, how well I cared for his clothes. The prospect of his older brother's visit seemed to completely destabilize him. "Is he very strict?" I asked, trying to understand his nervousness. "Theodore is a judge in Atlanta. He judges everything and everyone, inside and outside the courtroom." Gerald adjusted his collar as if it had suddenly become too tight. "I'm going to my study now. I need to organize some documents before his arrival." That's when it happened. In his agitated state, Gerald made a mistake he had never made before. After locking himself in his study, he forgot the small key in the drawer lock where he kept the red leather diary. I noticed this when I entered with the tea I always served him on these nights. He was so absorbed in writing, so disturbed by his brother's imminent visit, that he barely noticed my presence. I placed the cup on the table and left quietly, but the image of that little golden key remained etched in my mind like a brand. That night, I couldn't sleep. Beside me, Gerald snored lightly, exhausted after his writing session, which lasted longer than usual. My heart was beating so hard that I feared he might hear it. The key, the drawer, the red diary. Every Thursday for almost 5 years. Around 2 a.m., I gathered my courage. I slipped out of bed, putting on my silk robe, his gift for our last wedding anniversary. I walked barefoot down the hallway, avoiding the floorboards I knew creaked. The old house seemed to whisper around me, as if wanting to warn me or encourage me. I couldn't tell which. The study was bathed in the silvery light of the full moon coming through the window. I didn't need to light any lamp. I approached the massive oak desk, feeling Gerald's scent still lingering in the air, mixed with the smell of paper and ink. The key was still there, small, golden, forgotten by a man who was always so meticulous. It was as if fate had conspired for this moment. I turned the key slowly, fearing the click of the lock might echo throughout the house. The drawer slid smoothly, revealing the red leather diary, exactly as I had imagined it would be, centered, aligned with the edges of the drawer, like everything in Gerald's organized life. I picked it up with trembling hands. The leather was soft to the touch, worn at the edges from constant use. On the cover, in golden letters, now a little faded, "Memories and Reflections, G.W., the initials of Gerald Augustine Wilson." For a moment, I hesitated. Invading his privacy seemed wrong, even after years of pretense on my part. But something inside me insisted that it wasn't just curiosity, it was necessity, perhaps even self-preservation. I took a deep breath and opened the diary. The pages were filled with that cursive writing that I claimed not to be able to read. Lines and lines of confessions, reflections, and secrets. I began with the most recent entry, dated that same day. Thursday, July 18, 1968. Theodore comes on Saturday. Whenever I receive news from him, I feel like I'm being judged again by my own blood. He suspects the loans, I'm sure. I'll need to hide the documents better. Fortunately, Dorothy continues to be the same simple and obedient wife I married. Her ignorance is my greatest security. I felt as if I had been slapped. Simple, ignorance. Is that how he saw me, how he described me in his most intimate thoughts? I continued reading, now driven by both hurt and curiosity. The previous pages revealed a pattern. Every Thursday, Gerald wrote about his side businesses, as he called them. Loans with outrageous interest rates to families in difficulty. Smuggled merchandise hidden in the store's basement. Bribes paid to city inspectors. An entire world of corruption and dishonesty hidden behind the facade of the respectable merchant. But what truly made my heart stop was an entry from 6 months earlier. Thursday, January 20th, 1967. Transferred another $50,000 to the account in Atlanta. In 3 years, I'll have enough to start a new life away from this provincial town. Marjorie remains anxious, but I assured her that when the time is right, I'll leave everything behind, including my foolish wife. An educated woman would ask questions, demand explanations about my constant travels, question finances. Dorothy just smiles and nods, happy with her new dresses and her church friends. Her ignorance is truly a blessing for my plans. Marjorie. Who was Marjorie? And an account in Atlanta. Plans to abandon me in 3 years. I turned back several pages, looking for more information. I found various mentions of this woman, including details of meetings during the supposed business trips Gerald took monthly to the state capitol. There were even descriptions of a house he was building for them in an upscale neighborhood of Atlanta. The diary revealed a completely different man from the one I was married to. In those red pages, Gerald showed himself to be calculating, cold, manipulative. He saw our marriage only as a temporary convenience, a stepping stone in his social climbing, a disguise for his shady businesses. Her farming family gave me the respectability I needed in this town of gossips, he wrote in an entry from 1965. And her beauty compensates for her lack of refinement, but beauty withers with time. And I need to think about the future. Marjorie has education, connections in Atlanta, and understands the business world as a woman should, in silence, without interfering. I read for almost 2 hours, absorbing every word, every plan, every lie. It was like discovering that I had been living with a stranger all those years. The man who kissed my forehead every morning before leaving for the store, who brought me chocolates when he returned from trips, who sometimes called me his ray of sunshine. This man was planning to discard me as if I were nothing, relying on my supposed ignorance to never find out. The pain was almost physical, as if each word in that diary was a small blade cutting my heart. But along with the pain, something else began to grow inside me. A fierce determination, a cold and calculated anger that I had never felt before. I remembered Ophelia's words, "Knowledge is a powerful weapon." And now I had knowledge, the most powerful knowledge of all, the truth about the man with whom I shared my life. Carefully, I copied some of the most revealing entries in a small notebook that I kept hidden for my writing practice. I noted dates, values, names. I documented details about the bank account in Atlanta, about the house being built, about the illegal businesses. Then, with the same care, I closed the diary, placed it exactly in the position where I had found it, closed the drawer, and removed the key. I returned to the bedroom and slipped under the covers next to the man who I now knew was my enemy. He moved slightly in his sleep, mumbling something unintelligible, and placed an arm over me in a gesture that I would once have considered affectionate, but now seemed like a prison. I stiffened for a moment. Then I forced my body to relax. I needed to continue acting. But now the role I played had completely changed. No longer the naive wife, pretending not to know how to read to please her traditional husband. Now I was a woman at war, using my supposed ignorance as camouflage, preparing myself for a battle that Gerald didn't even imagine he would be facing. That night, as I watched the first rays of sun enter through the bedroom window, I made a decision. I would use the knowledge I now possessed to build my own liberation, but I wouldn't act impulsively. No, I would be as meticulous as he was, as patient, as calculating. If Gerald thought my ignorance was his greatest security, I would transform this false ignorance into his greatest trap. I would continue pretending not to know how to read. I would continue being the perfect, obedient, simple wife. And meanwhile, behind the scenes, I would begin to weave the net that would eventually capture him. The clock on the nightstand showed 5 o'clock in the morning when I finally closed my eyes, not to sleep, but to start planning. And for the first time since I had discovered my husband's true intentions, I felt a smile form on my lips. The war had begun, and I had the advantage of surprise. The morning after the discovery of the diary, I woke up with a clarity I had never experienced before. The world around me seemed sharper, as if a fog had dissipated. I looked at Gerald, having his breakfast, reading the town newspaper as he did every morning, and wondered how I hadn't noticed the falsity hidden behind those brown eyes. "Sleep well, my dear?" he asked, without taking his eyes off the newspaper. Very well, darling, I replied, with the same sweet tone as always, serving him more coffee. My mind, however, was working frantically. I needed a careful, methodically elaborated plan. I couldn't simply confront him with what I had discovered. That would only alert him, and he was smart enough to deny everything, to make me look like the villain, the meddling wife who invaded his privacy. "I'm anxious about Theodore's visit tomorrow," commented Gerald, folding the newspaper. "Make sure everything is impeccable. My brother has hawk eyes for any imperfection." "I'll make everything perfect," I promised, thinking about how important this visit could be for my new plans. Theodore Wilson, the older brother, the judge, the man Gerald most feared and respected. In the diary pages, Gerald mentioned several times how he feared Theodore would discover his illegal businesses, how his disapproval was the only thing that still kept him minimally within the boundaries of the law. Theodore, with his unbearable moral rectitude, he had written in a particularly bitter entry, always thinking he can judge me with his eyes of an incorruptible judge. While cleaning the house that day, preparing it for the visit, I began to elaborate my plan. First, I needed to ensure regular access to the diary. The luck of the forgotten key wouldn't easily repeat itself with a man as methodical as Gerald. Then, I needed a safe place to keep the evidence I would collect. And finally, I needed allies. Ophelia would be my first confidant. I wouldn't tell her everything at once, but enough to start moving. That same afternoon, with the excuse of buying fresh flowers for Theodore's visit, I went to the florist, which was just 2 blocks from the bank where Ophelia worked. I calculated the time to coincide with her lunch break. As expected, I found her leaving the bank exactly at noon. I waved discreetly, and she crossed the street to meet me. "What a pleasant surprise, Dorothy, buying flowers for the house." "Yes, Gerald's brother is visiting us tomorrow," I replied, selecting some white lilies. Then, lowering my voice, I added, "I need to talk to you about something important. It's about books." Our code for meeting without raising suspicions was always books. Ophelia understood immediately. "How about coming to my house on Sunday after church? I have some new ones you'll love." It would be perfect. That night and the following day passed in a blur of preparations. I cleaned every inch of the house, prepared the guest room, cooked the favorite dishes Gerald had mentioned his brother enjoyed, all while maintaining my role as the dedicated, semi-illiterate wife. Theodore arrived punctually at 5 in the afternoon on Saturday, tall like Gerald, but thinner, with completely gray hair despite being only 52 years old. His eyes were the same brown color, but they had a different intensity, not calculating like his brother's, but penetrating, as if they could see through people. "So, this is the famous Dorothy," he said, taking my hands in his. "My brother did not exaggerate about your beauty." I blushed, not from the false modesty I usually displayed, but from the opportunity I saw opening before me. This man would be fundamental to my plans, even without knowing it. During dinner, I carefully observed the dynamics between the brothers. Gerald, normally so confident and dominant, seemed diminished in Theodore's presence. He spoke more quietly, chose his words carefully, avoided certain topics. "And how is Gerald's business?" Theodore asked, while savoring the stew I had prepared. "Very well, the store prospers. We're expanding into imported fabrics." "Interesting. I heard there was an increase in smuggling seizures at the border. Foreign fabrics without taxes are entering the country in alarming numbers." Gerald swallowed hard, his fork stopping halfway to his mouth. "Really? I didn't know. All my suppliers are legitimate." Of course," replied Theodore, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Later, when I served coffee in the living room, Theodore turned to me with genuine interest. "Gerald told me you're learning to read, Dorothy. It's admirable. Many women of your generation didn't have that opportunity." I cast a quick glance at Gerald, who nodded slightly, as if giving permission for me to speak about the subject. "Yes, sir, I'm trying. It's difficult when you start late, but your brother has been patient with me." "She can already read simple words," intervened Gerald with that condescending tone that now turned my stomach. "But cursive writing is still a complete mystery to her." Theodore frowned slightly. That reminds me of our mother. She also had no formal education, but she had a natural wisdom that made up for it. I'm sure you also have many other talents, Dorothy. She's excellent in the kitchen and keeps the house impeccable, Gerald hastened to say, as if that was the most that could be expected from a woman. Something in Theodore's gaze told me that he saw more than Gerald imagined. For a brief moment, I felt the urge to tell everything, to reveal the truth about my literacy, about what I had discovered in the diary. But prudence prevailed. It wasn't the right time yet. On Sunday, after church, I got my desired conversation with Ophelia. With the excuse of returning a book, I went to her house, a small but elegant residence where she lived alone, another rarity for women at that time. I discovered something terrible, I confessed, as soon as we were safely inside her living room. Gerald is not who I thought. He's been living a double life. I told her about the diary, about the other woman, about the plans to abandon me, about the illegal businesses. I didn't mention that I had discovered everything by reading the diary. I just said I had found a letter to maintain the impression that I still needed help reading complex texts. Ophelia listened to everything with a grave expression, but not particularly surprised. I always suspected there was something wrong with him, she said finally. Men who need to keep their wives in ignorance usually have something to hide. What should I do, Ophelia? If I confront him, he'll simply deny everything. She thought for a moment, her fingers drumming on the teacup. You need concrete evidence, not just what you saw in the diary, and you need a position of strength before any confrontation. That's how our plan was born. Over the following months, with Ophelia's discreet help, I began collecting evidence of Gerald's schemes. Small things at first: receipts found in his pockets, telephone conversations overheard behind doors, names and addresses copied from his agenda. I also began my own small movement toward financial independence. Ophelia taught me the basics of how banks worked and opened a secret savings account for me. "Where did you get this money?" asked the manager, surprised by the amount I was depositing. "Market savings," I replied simply. In truth, it was money that over the years I had discreetly set aside from what Gerald gave me for household expenses. Never too much at once, just enough not to be noticed. Every Thursday, when Gerald locked himself with his diary, I found ways to spy. Sometimes I could hear parts of what he mumbled while writing. Other times, I found ways to obtain the key for brief moments, accidentally spilling something on his jacket and taking it to clean, for example. On one such occasion, while he was taking a bath, I managed to make an impression of the key in a piece of soap. Ophelia had a locksmith friend who, without asking questions, produced a perfect copy. Now I could access the diary whenever Gerald was away. The months turned into a year, and then into 2. Slowly, meticulously, I wove my web of truth around his lies. I copied entries from the diary, documented dates, values, names. I learned through Ophelia about how the loans with abusive interest rates that Gerald made worked, about how to identify smuggled merchandise, about marital property laws. "You would make an excellent lawyer or investigator, Dorothy," Ophelia joked once, amazed by my persistence. "Just a woman protecting her future," I replied with a determination that grew with each new fragment of evidence collected. At home, I continued to be the same dedicated wife as always. I cooked, cleaned, smiled. When Gerald taught me to read, I demonstrated slow and frustrating progress. I celebrated like a child when I managed to decipher a simple word. I always complained about the damn cursive writing that I couldn't understand. Gerald, completely involved in his own secrets, never suspected mine. The predator didn't realize that he was slowly being transformed into prey. In the spring of 1970, Theodore came to visit us again. This time, I found a way to have a few moments alone with him. While Gerald was busy at the store, I brought coffee to Theodore in the garden. "Your brother told me you were very strict with a case of illegal loans recently," I commented casually, serving the coffee. "Yes, a loan shark who ruined several families," he replied, surprised by my interest in legal matters. Justice was severe as it should be. And if someone knows about such cases but is afraid to report them? Theodore looked at me intensely. That person should know that the law protects witnesses, Dorothy, especially when they are victims or are in a vulnerable position. Our eyes met for a long moment. I didn't say anything else, but I felt that a seed had been planted. After this visit, I intensified my collection of evidence. I managed to photograph some pages of the diary using a small camera that Ophelia lent me. I documented suspicious bank transactions that I found in papers Gerald left in his study. I listed names of people who had been victims of his abusive loans. By the end of 1972, almost 5 years after my first discovery, I felt I was ready. Gerald's diary revealed that his plans were accelerating. The house in Atlanta was almost completed. Marjorie was pressuring for a resolution. He planned to liquidate his business in our town in the coming months, transfer all the money to secret accounts, and then simply disappear, leaving me with nothing. In his words, "Dorothy will be fine. Her family can take her back. A beautiful and obedient woman like her will soon find another husband, even without a penny, and I will finally be free to live the life I've always deserved with a woman who is at my intellectual level." The anger I felt reading these lines almost made me act impulsively, but I hadn't worked meticulously for so long to ruin everything. Now my plan needed to be executed at the right time, in the right way. It was time to use my most powerful card, Theodore. One afternoon when Gerald was on a business trip, which I knew was a meeting with Marjorie in Atlanta, I sat at the desk where he wrote his diary. With the pen in hand, I began to write a long letter addressed to his brother. This time, I didn't pretend difficulty. I let my handwriting flow naturally, clear, firm, educated. I attached copies of the most damning evidence. I explained everything, how I learned to read in secret as a child, how I realized that Gerald preferred to keep me ignorant, how I discovered the diary and his plans over the years. I sealed the envelope addressed to the courthouse in Atlanta where Theodore worked. Inside, besides the letter and evidence, I placed a small additional note. "Dear Theodore, I don't seek revenge, only justice. The time to reveal everything approaches. I will be waiting for your contact. With respect, Dorothy." I sent the letter via a special service that guaranteed delivery in person. Ophelia helped me with this, so there would be no records that I had been to the post office. And then I waited. The web was complete. Now it was time to see if the predator would fall into it. A week later, I received a succinct telegram. "Matter received and analyzed. Will be there Saturday. Total discretion. TW." When Gerald returned from his trip, I casually told him that his brother had sent a telegram announcing a surprise visit. "Theodore, this weekend?" His face visibly paled. Did he say why? No, just that he had business in town and would like to stay with us. I was so happy that I immediately responded yes. Gerald spent the next few days visibly agitated, reviewing papers, making hurried calls, even burning some documents in the fireplace at night when he thought I was sleeping. I observed everything in silence, knowing that the hour of truth was finally approaching. After nearly 10 years pretending not to know how to read, I was about to show not only that I knew, but that I had used this knowledge to carefully dismantle the castle of lies that my husband had built. And most ironically, it would all begin with a diary written in cursive, the same handwriting that I swore I couldn't decipher, the same handwriting that he believed was his perfect protection against my ignorant eyes. The day of reckoning was approaching, and I was ready. The web of truth was complete, waiting for its creator to finally realize that all this time he wasn't the predator he thought he was, but the prey that I had patiently cornered. The morning of Saturday, April 7th, 1973, dawned with an almost symbolic clarity. The sky was an intense blue, without a single cloud, as if nature wanted to ensure that nothing obscured what was about to happen. I woke up before dawn, something unusual for me, but the weight of the day ahead made it impossible to continue sleeping. Beside me, Gerald also seemed agitated in his sleep, murmuring unintelligible words, his face contracted in an expression of concern, even in his dreams. I observed him for a few moments. This man with whom I had shared a bed for almost 10 years, this stranger who never really knew me. I rose silently and went to the kitchen to prepare breakfast. Theodore would arrive around 10 a.m., and everything needed to be perfect. Not out of anxiety to please as before, but because this would be the final act of the play I had meticulously staged for a decade. While the water for coffee boiled, I thought about how my life had changed since that January night in 1968 when I first discovered the diary. The naive young woman I had been had completely disappeared, replaced by a woman who had learned to use silence as a weapon, patience as a strategy, and knowledge as power. Gerald appeared in the kitchen already dressed in his best gray suit, as if he were going to a formal hearing and not receiving his brother at home. "Good morning," he said, his voice tense. "Did you prepare the guest room as I asked?" "Yes, dear. Everything is ready. The best towels, the linen sheets your mother gave us as a wedding present, fresh flowers on the nightstand." He nodded distractedly, taking the coffee I served him. "Did Theodore say how long he intends to stay?" "No. He only mentioned he had business to attend to here." Gerald drummed his fingers on the table, a nervous habit he rarely showed. "Did you notice anything strange in his tone when he sent the telegram? Did he seem angry or too formal?" I raised my eyebrows in false innocence. "I can't read that well, Gerald, you know that. But the post office girl who read it to me didn't mention anything unusual." He relaxed a bit, but his eyes remained restless. "I'm going to the store to resolve some pending matters before his arrival. I'll be back at 9. As soon as he left, I ran to the bedroom and opened the small jewelry box where I kept my copy of the diary drawer key. Not to read, I already knew everything I needed to know, but to ensure it would be exactly where it should be. This was a day when nothing could go wrong. At 9:30, Gerald returned, even more tense than when he left. He brought with him a brown leather portfolio that he placed in his study. From the sound of the key turning, I realized he locked it inside, more evidence being hidden, I imagined. "I prepared the lunch that Theodore likes best," I commented while arranging flowers at the center of the living room table. "That chicken with pecans he praised so much last time." Gerald barely responded, consulting his pocket watch for the third time in 5 minutes. Punctually at 10 o'clock, we heard the sound of a car stopping in front of the house. Gerald adjusted his tie, ran his hand through his hair, and headed to the door. I followed, assuming my role as the dedicated wife for the last time. Theodore got out of the car, tall and imposing in his dark suit. His eyes, usually warm when he saw me, were serious today. He greeted his brother with a brief handshake, nothing like the usual hug, and then he turned to me with a contained smile. "Dorothy, so good to see you again." "The pleasure is all mine, Theodore. Welcome to our home." He held my hand for a moment longer than usual, a subtle gesture of solidarity that Gerald didn't notice, too occupied with his own anxiety. We entered, and I offered coffee, which Theodore accepted while Gerald refused, claiming he had already had too much. In truth, I knew he was too nervous to eat or drink anything. After a few minutes of trivial conversation about the trip and the weather, Theodore placed the cup on the table and looked directly at his brother. "Gerald, I didn't come just for a social visit. There are serious matters we need to discuss." My husband's face lost all color, but he tried to maintain his composure. "Of course, we can go to my study." "Actually," interrupted Theodore, "what I have to address involves Dorothy too. I prefer that we talk here, the three of us together." My heart accelerated. It was now. After almost 10 years, the moment of truth had finally arrived. Theodore removed a sealed brown envelope from the briefcase he carried. "I've received disturbing information, Gerald. Information about your business, your personal arrangements, and your future plans." "I don't know what you're talking about," Gerald responded automatically, but his voice failed on the last word. "I believe you do," continued Theodore, opening the envelope and removing a stack of papers from it. I have evidence here of loans with abusive interest rates made to vulnerable families in our town. I have records of smuggled merchandise stored in the basement of your store. I have documents about a bank account in Atlanta that doesn't appear in any of your official declarations. Each word seemed like a physical blow to Gerald, who would shrink slightly with each new accusation. His eyes moved frantically between his brother and the papers, trying to understand how all of that had reached Theodore. I also have this, said the judge, removing from the envelope an object that made my heart almost stop. The red leather diary. Gerald turned completely pale. How? How did you get that? It was locked in my study. That doesn't matter now, replied Theodore. What matters is its content. You had no right to invade my privacy like that, exclaimed Gerald, his voice rising in panic. These are my personal thoughts, my private reflections. Private reflections? Repeated Theodore coldly. You call your plans to abandon your wife, your confessions about illegal business, and your meetings with another woman private reflections? Gerald turned to me then, his eyes wide in desperation. Dorothy, don't believe him. They're lies, distortions, misunderstandings. I maintained my expression carefully confused and hurt, as if I were trying to comprehend something beyond my capacity. I don't understand, Gerald. What is he talking about? It was at this moment that Theodore did something that changed everything. He opened the diary to a marked page and extended it to me. Dorothy, I know you have difficulties with reading, especially with cursive writing, but perhaps it's time to try. I looked at the open diary, at the lines of elegant calligraphy that I supposedly couldn't decipher. My hand trembled slightly as I took it, not from nervousness, but from contained emotion. A decade of pretense, of necessary lies coming to an end. I don't know if I can read this, I murmured, looking at the page. Try, insisted Theodore gently. Just try. Gerald laughed nervously. This is ridiculous. She can barely read block letters, let alone my handwriting. Let's end this farce, Theodore. Tell me what you want from me, and let's finish this. I ignored him and pretended effort, moving my lips silently, as I always did when trying to read. Then, slowly, I began to read aloud. Thursday, February 15th, 1973. Marjorie is impatient. The house is almost ready, and she wants me to fulfill my promise of leaving everything behind. I explained that I need a few more months to liquidate the business here and transfer the rest of the money. Dorothy continues to suspect nothing. Poor fool. Her ignorance has always been my greatest protection and will soon be just a distant memory in my new life. I raised my eyes from the diary and faced Gerald directly. There was no more confusion in my gaze, no submission, no pretense. For the first time in 10 years, I allowed him to see the real Dorothy, the woman who knew perfectly how to read, who knew all his secrets, who had patiently gathered the evidence for his own judgment. Poor fool, I repeated, my voice clear and firm. Poor fool, I who believed in you, who trusted you, who dedicated 10 years of my life to you. Gerald looked as if he had seen a ghost. His mouth opened and closed without emitting sound, his eyes wide in horrified understanding. You know how to read, he finally managed to say, the words coming out like a strangled sigh. I always knew, I replied, closing the diary with a soft snap. I learned as a child, hidden from my father, who had the same ideas as you about women and education. And from the beginning of our marriage, I realized that you preferred to keep me in ignorance, that you felt safer believing I was incapable of understanding your documents, your business, your secrets. So you pretended all this time, he said, understanding transforming into anger. You deceived me just like I deceived you. The difference is that my deception hurt no one, I retorted calmly. Yours destroyed families with unpayable debts, financed illegal businesses, and planned to abandon me with nothing after years of marriage. Theodore, who had been observing our confrontation in silence, intervened. Dorothy contacted me, Gerald. It was she who sent me the first evidence of your schemes, who alerted me about the diary. But she didn't want revenge, just justice. Justice, repeated Gerald bitterly. You call this justice? Invading my privacy, conspiring behind my back, betraying my trust? I stood up then, feeling a strength I had never demonstrated before in his presence. Trust? What trust, Gerald? The trust you betrayed when you planned to abandon me? The trust you broke with each meeting with this Marjorie? The trust you violated with each entry in that diary, describing me as foolish and ignorant? Gerald tried one last desperate card, turning to his brother. This is a family matter, Theodore. Marital problems happen. There's nothing illegal about a man having indiscretions. Indiscretions, repeated Theodore coldly. I'm not here for your moral sins, Gerald, though they are many. I'm here because I have sufficient evidence to indict you for usury, smuggling, tax evasion, and fraud. Your marital indiscretion is just the tip of the iceberg of a life built on lies and crimes. It was as if all of Gerald's defenses collapsed at once. He sank into the sofa, arrogance replaced by absolute defeat. What happens now? He asked, his voice almost inaudible. From a legal standpoint, replied Theodore, you will face the consequences of your actions. There will be a process, and, with the evidence we have, probably a conviction. Gerald covered his face with his hands. And the store, the house, everything I built? The assets acquired during the marriage belong equally to Dorothy, said Theodore. As for the rest, it will depend on the outcome of the process and the restitutions you will have to make to your victims. There was a long silence then, broken only by the ticking of the wall clock. Finally, I got up and walked to the bookshelf where we kept family albums. I took a volume bound in blue leather and brought it to the center table. Do you know what this is, Gerald? I asked, opening the album. He looked without interest. Our wedding photographs. So what? Look more closely, I insisted. Between the pages of the album, carefully hidden, were copies of the main evidence I had collected over the years: receipts, photographs of documents, detailed notes of dates and values. This was my own diary, I explained. While you wrote your secrets in that red notebook, I documented each discovery, each revealed lie, each piece of the puzzle. And unlike your diary, mine had a greater purpose than simply venting. Mine sought justice. Gerald looked at those pages as if they were poisonous snakes. Why, Dorothy? Why didn't you confront me as soon as you discovered it? Why this elaborate staging for so many years? The question caught me by surprise. Not the question itself, but for realizing that, after so long focused on unmasking Gerald, I had never really articulated for myself the deeper motives of my strategy. Because you never gave me the chance to be heard as an equal, I finally replied. From the beginning, you decided who I should be. A beautiful and ignorant wife, a convenient trophy to display, and then discard. If I had confronted you the moment I discovered the diary, who would have believed me? Who would have given credit to the word of a semi-illiterate woman against a respected merchant in town? I took a few steps around the room, feeling decades of frustration finally finding words. You created a world where my voice had no value. So, I had to learn to survive in that world, to use your own rules against you. I had to become invisible to your eyes in order to really see who you were. A heavy silence filled the room after my words. Theodore looked at me with a mixture of admiration and compassion. Gerald seemed to have aged 10 years in an hour. What do you want after all? He finally asked, defeated. I want to start over, I replied simply. I want to live without lies, neither yours nor mine. I want to use the education I conquered in secret to help other women never need to pretend ignorance to survive. At that moment, for the first time in 10 years, I felt the weight of the charade leave my shoulders. I was no longer the submissive and limited wife that Gerald thought I was. I was no longer the actress playing a role day after day. I was simply Dorothy, a woman who had used the weapon they wanted to use against her, the supposed ignorance, to build her own liberation. The confrontation that followed, the legal consequences for Gerald, the division of assets. All this was just the epilogue of a story that in my mind had reached its climax at that moment of revelation. The exact instant when I picked up the red diary and fluently read aloud the words that he never imagined I could understand. Words in cursive writing, those worms dancing on paper, that for a decade I pretended not to be able to decipher. In the months that followed that confrontation in April 1973, my life completely transformed. Like a butterfly emerging from a cocoon, I left behind the Dorothy who pretended to become the woman I always was inside, and much more. Gerald faced the consequences of his actions. With the evidence presented by Theodore, he was indicted for various financial crimes. The trial was discreet to avoid scandal, but the sentence was rigorous: 3 years in prison and restitution to the families harmed by his abusive loans. Before being taken away, he asked to speak to me one last time. We met in the visiting room of the police station under the watchful eye of a guard. Gerald seemed to have aged 20 years in just a few weeks. The elegant clothes had been replaced by simple attire. The well-groomed hair now grew without care. "I still don't understand," he said, his voice low so that only I could hear. "How did you manage to deceive me for so long?" I looked into the eyes of the man I once believed I loved and replied with the simplicity of truth. "The same way you deceived everyone, Gerald. People see what they expect to see. You expected to see ignorance in me, so that was all you could perceive." He shook his head slowly. "And Marjorie, you knew about her from the beginning?" "Since 1968. Every letter, every meeting, every plan for your new life together. I knew everything." A heavy silence fell between us. Finally, he asked the question that seemed to really matter to him. "Did you ever truly love me, Dorothy?" The question caught me by surprise after everything that had happened. Was that what bothered him? His feelings, not mine. His damage, not what he had caused. Typical of Gerald, always the center of everything. "Yes," I answered honestly. "In the beginning, I truly loved the man I thought you were. Afterward, I learned to love the woman I discovered in myself." I rose to leave, but he gently held my wrist. "What will you do now? How will you live?" There was genuine curiosity in his voice, perhaps even concern. Perhaps, in his own distorted way, he had developed some kind of affection for me over the years. "I'll live as I should have lived from the beginning, without pretense, without lies, without needing to diminish who I am to fit the expectations of others." I left the police station feeling lighter than I had ever been. The divorce was finalized in record time, thanks to Theodore's discreet intervention. As part of the agreement, the house where we lived and half of the store's assets stayed with me. The other half was liquidated to pay restitutions to the victims of Gerald's schemes. The first months were a whirlwind of changes and discoveries. Suddenly, I was a divorced woman of 30 years, financially independent, in a small town in the early 1970s. The sharp tongues didn't take long to manifest. "Poor Dorothy, abandoned by her husband, who found another woman in the capital," whispered the ladies at church, not knowing that the truth was exactly the opposite. "A woman without education. How will she manage that huge house alone?" questioned others, completely ignoring my capabilities. It was Ophelia who gave me the advice that would change everything. "Use what they think against themselves, as you always did. If they think you can barely read, imagine their surprise when they see what you're capable of creating." And so, my big project was born. I transformed the living room of the house, that same room where Gerald had so many times exhibited his supposed intellectual superiority, into a small school for adult women. Not just to teach reading and writing, but to offer the kind of knowledge that was denied to us. Notions of legal rights, basic finances, women's history. I called it New Dawn School, with a discreet sign at the entrance. At first, only 3 timid students appeared. Josephine, a 52-year-old widow who was never allowed by her husband to study. Martha, our former maid, who dreamed of reading the letters her son sent from the army. And Margaret, a young 19-year-old wife whose violent husband forbade her to leave the house, but who managed to escape twice a week, pretending to go to the market. I taught with passion, using my own story as an example of the transformative power of knowledge. Gradually, word spread. In 6 months, I had 15 students. In a year, more than 30 women of different ages filled my living room, thirsty to learn. "I'm not just teaching you to read words," I would frequently say. "I'm teaching you to read the world, to read your rights, to read your own possibilities." For the younger ones, I offered hope for a different future. For the older ones, a chance to finally access a world that had been denied to them for decades. By 1975, when the UN declared the International Year of Women, our little school was known throughout the region. We received a visit from government representatives interested in our method of adult literacy. A journalist from a major newspaper in the capital came to do a report. "How did you, without formal pedagogical training, achieve such impressive results?" she asked, clearly surprised by the level of reading and writing of my oldest students. "Perhaps precisely because of that," I replied, smiling. "We don't just teach letters and numbers here, we teach dignity, self-confidence, and the right to occupy spaces that were denied to us." The report generated a wave of interest. We began to receive donations of books, teaching materials, even a small grant from the state government to expand our activities. With the resources, I bought the neighboring house, and we expanded the school. Now, in addition to literacy classes, we offered courses in professional sewing, household accounting, and even classes on basic legislation. These taught by a young lawyer who had recently graduated and volunteered. At the end of 1976, 3 years after the confrontation with Gerald, I received an unexpected letter. The paper had the letterhead of the state penitentiary, and the sender was Gerald himself. "Dear Dorothy," the letter began in his unmistakable cursive handwriting, now a little more trembling. "I heard indirectly about the success of your school. I confess I was surprised, although perhaps I shouldn't have been. You were always more than you appeared to be, weren't you? Perhaps that is the great lesson I take from this experience. Never underestimate anyone, especially those we believe we know completely." The letter continued with reflections on his time in prison, about how isolation had forced him to confront his own lies, his selfishness, his arrogance. It ended asking for forgiveness, not with the expectation of reconciliation, but as part of his own process of redemption. I didn't respond. Some chapters of life need to be definitely closed. That same year, I received another correspondence, this one much more welcome. Theodore, who had followed my work from afar, sent me an invitation to participate in a congress on adult education in the capital. It would be my first trip outside the city since my marriage, my first opportunity to share with a larger audience the lessons learned in our small school. "I'm nervous," I confessed to Ophelia, who was now not just my friend, but also a volunteer math teacher at the school. "What if they think I'm a country bumpkin, an amateur without a degree?" She took my hands between hers, those hands that had secretly held so many books, that had written so many words in hiding, and said firmly, "You faced a predator in your own home for 10 years, Dorothy. A room full of educators is nothing compared to that." The Congress was a watershed. My presentation on literacy as liberation, the experience of New Dawn School, attracted a packed room. I spoke with the conviction of someone who knew firsthand the transformative power of words, of someone who knew what it meant to use knowledge as both shield and sword. "Our approach doesn't separate learning to read from learning to fully exist in the world," I explained. "Each letter mastered is a small act of independence. Each sentence understood is a door that opens." At the end, the audience gave a standing ovation. University professors, representatives of educational foundations, they all wanted to know more about our method. I returned home with invitations to visit other cities, with promises of funding, with the certainty that what we had created transcended the walls of that old living room. In the years that followed, our school transformed into a community educational center. We expanded to include night classes for workers, tutoring for children, and even a small industrial sewing workshop that generated income for women in vulnerable situations. In 1980, I published my first book, Letters That Liberate, a practical method of literacy for adult women. It was a modest success, but enough to consolidate our methodology and inspire similar initiatives in other cities. The young woman who once pretended not to know how to read was now an author, educator, lecturer. Gerald served his sentence and was released from prison in 1976. I learned from Theodore that he had moved to a small coastal town where he lived modestly giving private accounting lessons. As for Marjorie, who would have been his companion in the new life he dreamed of, she apparently didn't wait for him. She married a businessman from Atlanta, and we never heard from her again. It's curious how life draws its paths. Gerald, who valued status and appearances so much, ended up living in the simplicity he always despised. I, who was forced to pretend intellectual limitations, ended up building a life dedicated to combating these same limitations in other women. In 1985, at 42 years old, I received an invitation to teach at a state university. It was an extraordinary opportunity, especially for someone without formal academic training. But my practical work, my publications, and mainly the results achieved at the New Dawn School spoke for themselves. I accepted, although I continued to be involved in the administration of the school, now managed by a board formed by former students. It was during this time that I met August, a professor of American literature, a widower with gentle eyes and stimulating conversations. Our relationship grew slowly, based on mutual respect and genuine admiration. We married in a simple ceremony in 1987, surrounded by friends from the school, colleagues from the university, and some of my first students, who were now independent women, many with their own businesses or careers. "I never thought I would find someone like you," August told me on our wedding night. "Someone who so deeply knows the value of words. If he only knew how deeply I really knew that value. The words that saved me, the words I used as a shield, the words that finally freed me." Our life together was peaceful and fulfilling. August never tried to diminish me, never felt threatened by my achievements. On the contrary, he was proud of them, encouraged me to go further, to write more, to share my experience more widely. In 1993, at 50 years old, I received the title of Honorary Citizen of the town, an honor I never imagined when I was just the semi-illiterate wife of the merchant Gerald. The mayor, while presenting the medal, highlighted, "Dorothy Mendenhall Wilson has not only transformed her own life, but offered hundreds of women the opportunity to transform theirs." August passed away in 2008, leaving an immense void, but also many sweet memories and a strength that he helped cultivate in me. I continued my work at the school and university until retiring in 2015 at 72 years old. Today, at 82, I look back and see a life marked by a great deception that transformed into an even greater truth. Sometimes, I visit the New Dawn School, now an educational institute with its own headquarters, various units throughout the state, and more than 50 teachers. On the entrance wall is framed the first page of the newspaper that published that pioneering report about our work. Next to it, in large letters, is a phrase that became our motto. "A woman's greatest weapon is not what others think she knows, but what she really knows and chooses to reveal." The young students who pass by there may not completely understand the meaning of these words. They were born in a different world, where women have more rights, more opportunities, more voice. But those who know my story, and it is told to each new class, understand the power contained in that phrase. When I look at these girls and women with their open notebooks and eager minds, I think of Gerald's red diary, those pages where he believed he had written my sentence of insignificance, but which ended up becoming the catalyst for my liberation. I think of the irony of how his cursive handwriting, which he thought was an infallible protection against my ignorant eyes, became precisely the symbol of the fall of his arrogance. And I think above all of the power of the stories we choose to tell about ourselves, about others, about the world. For 10 years I lived the story that Gerald wrote for me, that of the simple and incapable wife. But in the end, it was my own narrative that prevailed, that of the woman who used knowledge as a tool for personal and collective transformation. So, if you who are listening to me now are facing your own silent battle, if you're being underestimated or diminished, remember, your true strength may be precisely in what others don't see in you. As I learned so many decades ago, sometimes we need to use others' ignorance as our greatest ally until the day we can finally reveal who we really are and change not only our story, but the story of many others around us. This was my story, the story of how I pretended not to know how to read for 10 years until the day I read my husband's diary to the person he feared most, the story of how hidden words transformed into a life of shared words, the story that is now also part of yours. If this journey touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and share with someone who needs to hear this message. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to know. Until the next story.